So now we're going to line up the map with reality. And then if I come back again, and it's right on the money.
基隆会让你想到什么？雨下个不停的冬天，还是庙口夜市的小吃？来到基隆，你会想去逛哪些景点？正滨渔港、阿根纳造船厂，还是到北海岸看看自然的风景？如果你喜欢探索历史，或许你会想听听接下来的故事。1881到1885年间，清帝国与法国爆发多起军事冲突，其中包含了基隆战役。即使战争至今已过100年，基隆的山区仍留有许多遗址，这留给对历史有兴趣的人考古的一片天地。Jerry Johnson 是一个在台湾工作多年的加拿大人，由于个人的志业，多年来他独自研究清法战争的历史，查阅史料与文献，并实地踏查比对，累积许多有趣的发现。今天就让我们跟着 Jerry 一起走入基隆的郊山，看看流藏在山区里的遗址，也听听这里发生过的故事吧。
Okay, so here we are at Shicholing Pautai, also known as Fort Shicholing, and it's overlooking the Geelong Harbor. Back in 1884-1885, this fort was known as Fort Danshui by the French when they were here. But back in 1884-1885, it looked a lot different than this. That's because when the Japanese came in 1895, they completely demolished this and redesigned it into the fort that it looks like today. But for our story today, we're actually going to go back to the French period, 1884-1885, and we'll start with Fort Danshui. So this is a good place to start with the story, but actually the story started years before in 1881 in Vietnam. So that's where I'm going to start the history. So basically back in 1881, there was 3 regions in what we now call Vietnam. So in the south, there was a place called Cochinchine, and that was under French control. That was like a French colony. And then in the middle, there was a larger space called Annam. And then in the north, which we would call North Vietnam, this was called Tonkin at that time. So both Annam and Tonkin were kind of like protectorates or vassal states of China. And so China had great interest in these 2 regions. The French had designs to kind of control all of Vietnam at that time. And so inevitably there was a dispute, and the French took over Hanoi. And so this is where problems escalated between the French and the Chinese. So eventually what happened was that there was a war at the beginning with soldiers of Tonkin and Annam who were under Chinese control, but the Chinese were not actually involved in the fight at the beginning. So there was a group called the Black Flags, Chinese pirates, and they were fighting the French for a while. But then things started to escalate through 1883 into 1884, and then that's when the Chinese started bringing in their own troops, and these started to develop into full-scale battles. But what's interesting is that the French and the Chinese, neither one of them declared war on each other, and yet there was a lot of bloodshed. So these battles just kept getting bigger and bigger, and the French started pouring in more armies, and the Chinese were pouring in armies. And eventually by May 1884, the French had actually pushed the Chinese back to their border. The Chinese sued for peace, and then the French and the Chinese signed an agreement called the Tientsin Convention. And in this convention, the Chinese agreed to leave Tonkin and go back to China, and the French would get their goal of occupying all of Cochinchine, Annam, and Tonkin. So basically all of modern Vietnam is what the French were after. The problem is with this treaty is that they didn't explain when the Chinese were to leave Tonkin. So both sides agreed, but they didn't agree to when this was going to happen. So when we got into June 1884, the French were thinking, okay, the Chinese have left, and they went into the north. And then right near the border, they were heading towards this town called Lang Son. And they came across a much larger Chinese army positioned in the hills. the French were very surprised. They said, how come you guys are still here? And the Chinese were saying, how come you guys are here? And so there was a confrontation. And then this developed into a full-scale battle. And a number of French soldiers were killed. And so this battle is known as the Baclay ambush. And Baclay is the small village near where this battle occurred. So as you can imagine, the French were super upset, and all of the population were outraged. The French leader at the time, Jules Ferry, was outraged and said that this was Chinese treachery. And so they put in the demands. They said, you know, we demand that first of all you apologize for this, for breaking the treaty and this treachery. And secondly, for the French deaths and all of the problems that you've caused, we demand that you pay 250 million francs to us in damages. And so the French waited for the Chinese to answer. They didn't answer. And so the French set a deadline of August 1st. And they said, if you don't do this by August 1st, you know, there's going to be big trouble and it's going to escalate. So during the months that the French were waiting for the Chinese to either meet the deadline or not meet the August 1st deadline, they were looking around for something that they could use as a bargaining chip, just in case the Chinese decided not to meet this August 1st deadline. So they looked up and down the coast of China. They looked around. They're trying to find something of equal value to the 250 million francs that they believed that they were owed. So they looked around and they looked around, and then finally they found what they were looking for, which is this spot here, which is Geelong. So we're looking at the harbor here. And specifically what the French were interested in was a number of coal mines which were actually to the east of the harbor by a couple of kilometers. So if you go in that region to the east, they had coal mines and they actually made quite a bit of money. So the French were thinking, if we can take those coal mines, we can actually take the profits from those, get some taxes, and then we can maybe get similar to the amount of the 250 million francs that the Chinese owe us. So they made up a plan, and then August 1st, when the Chinese did not say anything, they didn't pay this money, they didn't apologize, then the French made an announcement and they said, okay, this is it, this is the expiration, and they decided to go to their next plan, which was to take Geelong. So soon after that, the French came here with a warship and a couple of smaller ships, and they had a lot of confidence that they could easily take this whole area, including the coal mines, take all of the city with just a handful, a couple of hundred sailors. They came into the city, they bombarded it first, came in here with sailors, occupied that hill that we see straight ahead, and they were quite confident. They said, okay, this is good, you know, so far. But they had no idea that there was thousands of Chinese soldiers hiding in these hills. The Chinese were led by Liu Mingchuan. He's a famous Chinese general at the time. And they pushed the sailors back onto their ships, and the French were defeated. So the French were obviously very embarrassed by that. This was not the result that they expected. They thought the Chinese would be a pushover. Even though they were outnumbered, this was an embarrassment. So the French leader at the time, Jules Ferry, was very determined to get revenge. He was determined that they're going to come back and they will take Geelong this time. So a couple of months later, in October, the French brought back around 2,000 Marines, and they came to the same harbor. And this time, they had a plan to take over the whole harbor properly this time. If you can see behind me straight ahead, there's a little hill back there that's called Mount Clement, or Mont Clément in the French. And they decided their attack was going to be to take that hill and then all of the hills around and then come to this position. So after the Battle of Mount Clement, when the French pushed the Chinese back, the Chinese decided to evacuate Geelong. So they basically left. They left the whole city evacuated. The French had no idea until they decided to attack some of these other fort positions, and they found that they were completely empty. So then the French came over this way, and they took this whole ridge line, which is filled with walls and trenches that the Chinese made, and they even took this position that we're in right now, which they renamed Fort Danshui, because right near the fort is a road that goes from Geelong to Danshui. This was the old road to Danshui. So they took this position and made it their own, and then they also took a nearby hill, which we can see from here, which was called Ni Daig, or Eagle's Nest. So the French had these two positions, but with only 2,000 Marines, they didn't have enough guys to completely occupy the whole area. And this became very, very quickly obvious that there was not enough guys. So what happened was the French had these two positions, but there's another hill right behind that's like 300 meters away, and the French called that La Dent, or the Tooth, and they had to leave that to the Chinese. So there's a lot of very close shooting that occurred over the next few months. So the Marines did a great job of holding this position with such few men, and everything was going okay, but the Chinese still were not interested in an apology or giving this 250 million francs. The war was now starting up again in Tonkin. The war was continuing there. Again, the French and the Chinese still had not declared war, but they're still fighting these huge battles. And then by around October, November, so maybe a month later after the French came here, then the weather started to change. And then when the weather changed, then there was these cholera outbreaks. Suddenly, a lot of French and Chinese started dying of cholera. So the French numbers by November, December started to reduce under 1,000 guys. Plus, there was also a number of French Marines who actually were at the end of their service. So hundreds of guys actually went back to France either by just going back, end of their service, or they died, or they were sick. The numbers went down to around like 900 guys that had to occupy this whole area. Meanwhile, the Chinese were bringing in massive amounts of troops and equipment, and their numbers went up from 5,000 up to 10,000, 15, even up to 20,000. So the odds became incredible. It was almost like 10 or 20 to 1 odds. The French were still very successful. They had very, very good artillery at these positions. The Chinese, of course, had a lot of confidence. They attacked this position, but they were completely defeated. The Chinese just couldn't get past the French artillery to get into Geelong. But the French couldn't sustain this. It was a very, very terrible situation for the French Marines. So by the end of 1884, they brought in reinforcements. The first thing to change was they brought in a new ground commander. This was a famous Lieutenant Colonel Duchesne, and he's very famous for relieving the first siege of Duanguang, which is a very famous battle site in Tonkin. And he was leading the French Foreign Legion, and so they posted him here. And then by the beginning of 1885, the French also sent reinforcements from Africa. So they had 4 companies from the French Foreign Legion. So these guys are very famous, and they were soldiers from all over Europe, basically German, Swiss, etc., who joined. And then the other one, also famous, they were called the Bataillon d'Afrique, or the Bat d'Af, and these guys were prisoner soldiers, and they were from the French penal colonies in Africa. So both of these two sets of very interesting soldiers came here to increase the numbers to around 3,000. So now the French were ready and determined to try and take this territory back from the Chinese. And especially what they were most interested in is that there's a very big hill here to the east, and this one the French called Fort Bamboo, and this overlooked all of Geelong. So this is what the French were most afraid of, is that the Chinese would put their artillery on top of that hill and they would just bombard down into the city. So this was the key objective of the French, was to remove the Chinese from all of these hill areas and push them back past the Geelong River. So the French now had all the reinforcements that they needed, and their basic goal was to take Fort Bamboo. But they knew they couldn't attack this fort head on. It's just way too fortified. You have to go fighting up a slope. And the Bat Daf had already tried that, and they lost in a famous battle. So they decided what they're going to do is they're going to take the Bat Daf, the Marines, and the French Foreign Legion, and they're going to swing more to the east and try and go down the Chinese positions that way. But again, they were blocked. All these hills were very, very difficult for the French to overcome. Also, the weather changed. So by January and February, it was raining constantly here. It was very, very cold. The rain was so heavy that the French couldn't move. There's just mud everywhere. So they just basically stayed in their positions for a month or so, and they were kind of waiting for the weather to get better. They also had to create a new plan because they just couldn't get through the Chinese defenses in this area. So by March 1885, the weather got better and the French had a new plan. So what they decided to do was to take another stab at this, again with the Marines, the Bat Daf, and the Legion. And this time they headed more towards the Pacific Ocean side of Taiwan, and then they would swing back over 8 kilometers, so a much further circular movement, and come down this incredible long length of Chinese positions and take Fort Bamboo. And so that's what they did. So finally, after a couple of days battles along the very far eastern front along the Chinese positions, on March the 7th, 1885, the French finally successfully pushed the Chinese off of Fort Bamboo, and they pushed them all the way down past the Geelong River. And so now the French were victorious all along this 8-kilometer front. And they were amazed because they had actually beaten a much greater Chinese force. Commander Duchesne estimated that this was 8-to-1 odds. So the Chinese had outnumbered the French by 8-to-1 in this battle. And he famously said that had he known these odds before starting this whole operation, he wouldn't have done it. So he himself was quite amazed. And all of the Bat Daf and the Marines and the French Foreign Legion, they were all greatly congratulated by Duchesne and also Admiral Courbet, who was the commander-in-chief of the whole operation. They thought this was an amazingly well executed operation. So everything was fine. The French occupied this whole area. The Chinese were over the river. But the problem is from Fort Danshui, where we're at now, it's 1 kilometer away to the river. They couldn't see what the Chinese were doing. So the captain of this fort, Captain Bertin of the Marines, he decided to go down and do a reconnaissance and try and find a new fort position. So Captain Bertin found this spur that was at the very end of this ridgeline that was overlooking the elbow of the Geelong River. And he felt that this spur was a great position to build a new fort. The purpose was to actually watch the Chinese and see what they were doing with their new fortifications on the other side of the Geelong River to the south. And the other purpose for this position was to harass the Chinese, to kind of hinder their progress with their own fortifications. So he wanted to build this as an artillery position. They originally wanted to put a number of cannons into this position. So they would bomb the Chinese, and they would also observe them at the same time. So if you're ready, maybe we can go there and have a look at the fort, unless you have any last questions.
A lot of questions.
Okay.
You feel like you know about these things very well. You
Sure.
must have done a lot of research. And how did you do the research?
Well, the research, there's a lot of different layers to the research that I had to do. So I could probably talk for a long time about everything that I did, but in summary, the first step is that you have to read a number of the books that the French soldiers wrote about the campaign. So we have to read their journals and their diaries and military reports, and that's to really understand the story first. And then the second thing that I had to do was to look at the maps. So you have to study the maps along with the stories that you've read. So yeah, I had to go and research in many libraries and museums around the world, many in France and Taiwan, of course, but also England and Canada and Israel, Switzerland, Holland, Japan. I had to go to many places to find documents and images and to study these.
And you say we're going to Fort Bertin now. How do you know where it is?
Well, that's a very good question because I could be leading you anywhere. So when we look behind us, there's a lot of mountains and hills and lots of jungle. So yeah, it's very confusing. And this is actually called the field research part of how I did the research. So the first part is studying the stories and looking at the maps and getting a general understanding of the history. And a lot of people do that, and that's good enough. But if you actually want to find out where these places are, like Fort Bertin, you actually have to study using field techniques. The very first thing that I did was look at the Google Maps on Google Earth, and it's very confusing. So you're trying to find out, and I was lost for quite a while. So probably the better place to start would be to get the French maps. Then you can use the Google Earth or the Google Maps to overlay the French map onto the Google map, and then you can have a general idea. But I quickly found that this is not enough. In fact, it still is very confusing, especially if you want to be precise about where these places are. And that's because the Earth's magnetic field has changed over the last 130, 140 years. And so that's different. And then also Google Earth and Google Maps also is not completely accurate either for other reasons. So when you put these two together, it's not exactly correct. So I found that, yeah, GPS is not enough. You still will get lost out here. So then the next thing that you have to do is you have to use I used Japanese military maps from like around 100 years ago. And these are topographical maps. So I use those, and I use modern topographical maps. And also you have to use a compass, because that's how the French put in their maps, is using compass technology. So it's better to use the same technology to find out where these places are. And then you have to compare all these maps together. But that's still not enough, because there's still variation between these maps, and also the French soldiers themselves, maybe they made some mistakes when they're putting in these maps as well, right? Because you're using triangulation techniques to find out where the hills are. And if you don't triangulate properly, you'll make a mistake and the map will be wrong. So the final technique that I would use is a thing that I learned from the US military manuals, and this is called terrain association. And they recommend that when you're using old maps. And that is that when you have an old map, you should compare it with the modern topographical map. And you do the same pencil work on the topographical map, and you compare the two, and you can actually count the ridges and the mountains, and you can count the valleys, and you get a pretty accurate view of that. And then the final step is to come out to nature, which is the fun part, and you bring your terrain association, you bring your compass, you bring your maps, and then you actually go there. So it's quite a long process. I wish it was as simple as just using GPS, but no, GPS will get you very lost very fast.
And what's the point of finding the real location of the fort or trenches, anything?
The point of finding these places, of course, is to see if they're actually still there. And what do they really look like? Do they look like what they appear on the map? So I was really curious about that. So that's the main reason why I did it. And I must say that it's probably one of the most exciting things that I've ever done, is because you go through all of this map work, you know, the field work that I told you about. You have to overlay the maps and the compass work and so forth. And after doing a number of calculations, I can predict that on top of a certain hill, there must be something there. So yeah, there's a lot of excitement to imagine, is there a fort there or not? And so I might spend a number of hours hiking through the jungle, cutting a trail up to the top of a hill. And then once you get to the top of the hill, yes, there's something there. It's amazing. So it's exactly like what the French described on their maps. Sometimes the fortifications are in exactly the same shape or the same angle, same position. And so it's very exciting because then now the story comes alive. So when the French tell you about what they did and they're hiding behind a wall and the Chinese are coming over, you're standing in exactly that position and you can visualize it perfectly. It's even down to the meter where a person was standing when they're telling the story. So to me, this was the whole point of it. And it just brings the story alive so that it's not just words on a page, but it's actually like the real history is right there. You're standing in it. And maybe even more exciting than that is that you're the only person in the world who knows this, right? You're standing in the jungle and you're standing in a fortification and the whole thing makes sense.
You said a lot of forts were in the jungle, so it's difficult to find them, right?
Yeah, it's difficult to find some of them. Actually, a lot of them in the jungle are quite easy to find because the French have indicated them on their maps. And as I said, if you go through the whole process of using the compass and you're using modern maps and ancient maps, you're using the terrain association, I wouldn't say difficult, but yeah, of course you have to hike, you have to cut through the jungle with a machete and so forth. That part is difficult. But I would say the more difficult part for me was actually finding the locations around the harbor. Is because a number of positions behind me in the harbor were radically changed. So if you have a look at the old French maps, they don't resemble what we see behind us. So there was actually a lot more water behind me before, there was a lot more mud. So what happened was when the Japanese came in, they completely changed the harbor inside. And then the Taiwanese, of course, changed the harbor even further. There's other reasons why they may have changed. Some of the hilltops are a little bit different. Some hills are missing, actually. And so, yeah, it is quite challenging. So you have to look at photographs, maps. You have to also read some of the Japanese and Taiwanese history. And then you can fully understand what the changes were. And then you can find these places. But yeah, it's not easy downtown. It is actually quite challenging. But interestingly enough, a lot of the roads and the configuration, especially the old paths, there are some old roads down in Geelong, and they have like a curve. So any curving kind of road, almost for sure that's an original road from 1885. And that's what's exciting, is to go downtown and to find some of the original paths. And you can check those by, again, you have to do the compass work and overlaying maps and so forth.
Wow, that sounds very exciting.
Yeah.
So one last question, can you show me how the compass work?
Yeah, sure. I can show you kind of a brief demonstration about how to use a compass and how I would. There's the compass, that's the first thing. And then the second thing is that we need the old French map here of the harbor. So generally the first thing that you start with is you want to find a known position in the harbor and then back sight to where you are. So I'm going to choose a place that I don't think has changed very much in the last 140 years. And so I'm going to say that ridge line in front of me that ends in a spur is probably a place that I'm going to choose. And right on top of that is a temple with 3 orange hats. So that's lined up there. Okay, so I'm going to take this compass reading and then I'm going to come back to this French map and just line these up. So on the French map at this same position was a place called Fort Burr, and when I line it up, it lines up. So the compass reading is basically perfect. Now there's also a slight magnetic field change in the last 130, 140 years by about 3 or 4 degrees. I'm taking that into a little bit of account, but basically this is right on. And then if I compare this also with a Japanese map of about 100 years ago, you'll also find that the compass reading is right on. So from Fort Danshui, now I'm going to measure where Fort Bertin is. And so if you trust my compass readings, we can go there now.